Hi and welcome everybody to our webinar today. My name is Christian Plaichner, Chief Customer Experience Officer at Tricentis, and today we want to talk about a strong business case for test transformation. Let's start with housekeeping. We will have all the microphones muted. If you have questions, please put them into the chat and we will answer them on the end of the session. The other thing I want to mention when it comes to housekeeping, this webinar and many others are in our resource center on our Tricentis website. So please go there and check out other content. So that said, let's jump into the topic. So as I mentioned, today we want to talk about the business case, and I'm very excited to have Jori with me today in this webinar. He is a Director for CX Strategy and Transformation here at Tricentis. So welcome, Jori. How are you?
Thank you. I'm really good today. Sunny day today here in Australia. Thank you. How are you, Christian?
I'm good. Wonderful. Hey, so let's jump directly into the topic, Jori. We all know business cases are getting more and more critical. We do so many for the last years with our global customers. And what I want to start with initially is to talk with our audience about why should you care about the business case and, why is it critical?
All right. Yeah. So that's a really good question, Christian. Thanks a lot for asking that. So we look basically at the World Quality Report. We see that the testing and QA budget in organizations is over time it's increasing. And the primary reason for that increase is because organizations are undergoing a digital transformation. They want to deliver software faster, and we have more releases. And that's also because they are going towards more an agile and a DevOps kind of working. And because of those additional releases of software, we are introducing more testing cycles into the development. And because of that, the budget increases and more time is spent on testing. At the same time, what we're seeing is that organizations are still have an automation rate of 14 to 18%, which is very low, which means that there is a big opportunity for us to basically decrease that 23% that is being spent on QA and testing, and that we can still do a lot of efficiency gains and a lot of effectivity gains from a testing perspective, from a time perspective, from a cost perspective, and also from a speed perspective. We want to make sure that testing basically is no longer the bottleneck in the software delivery process. Okay. So, what really makes a good business case, and why do we want to do that, right? So there are three main reasons. So first of all, it's a business justification, right? So we want to make sure that the business understands why we're doing that. So what value do we bring to the business when you make an investment in transforming testing? So it's about stakeholder buy-in and alignment, making sure that you have this top-down approach, that you have the buy-in from all your executives to undergo this change and to make this transformation. And thirdly, you want to make sure that with this clear business case, you want to make sure that everyone in the organization understands exactly what you're trying to do. What are your business outcomes that you're expecting, and what is the investment required from each and every one of them in the organization to make that happen. Christian, back to you.
Excellent. Okay, so I get it, and it sounds like, or I think it sounds pretty obvious, right? I mean, there are a lot of things that people have to do, and the logic is more and more companies turn into, let's say, software companies, right? And that means testing have to be part of the whole equation to be able to deliver new things faster in the right quality. The magic question from my perspective is, and I'm wondering why and how people should think about this and why they care is, what are the components, right? Because one thing is you can make always a nice looking business case. The question is really, what are the pieces that you have to consider to make it real and make it also achievable?
Yeah, that's a good question. So typically when people talk and organizations talk about a business case, or doing an ROI calculation, a very typical approach is just to look at a cost savings perspective, right? So we do manual testing. We're going to introduce test automation. How much can we save by introducing test automation? And whenever you're looking at a strong business case, that's only a very minor component, or that's only one of the three components that is required for a strong business case. There's a business case is so much more than just an ROI calculation. And basically, we at Tricentis here look at it from three different perspectives. We look at it from a time to market perspective, from a quality and risk perspective, and from an ROI perspective. So, and those three combined, if you sum that up and put that into one calculation, that's when you have a very strong business case. So let's have a look at those, right? So what does that specifically mean? So the first layer is the time to market layer, which basically means how long does it take me as an organization to have a new feature or a change in my application available to the consumer in the market, right? Why is this important? The longer it takes for me to release new features to the consumer or to my internal customers, if we're talking about enterprise applications, the longer it takes, the less agile you are as an organization, and the harder it is to respond to the market, right? So if we talk about, for example, a web application and we're launching a new product, and the launch might take us, let's say, a month to launch a new product, and then we're even delayed by another 2 weeks, that delayed launch will cost us revenue, right? Because all the time that we don't release that product into the market means that we can't sell that product and we can't get revenue from it. And maybe at the same time, our competitors might actually already have launched a product, and that will cost the business money, right? So speed is really becoming the new currency, as really the key here. So that's the first aspect. And the second aspect that we're looking at is more from a risk reduction perspective, right? So how many defects can we actually prevent from slipping into production? In other words, how can we avoid costs for having to do like another hypercare phase or having to fix things in production and preventing our business from being done because the systems are not working anymore after we deploy the release? So to be able to do that, you need to understand what your testing suite basically covers of your application. We do that with a measurement which we call business risk coverage. So basically, we map our test cases to the requirements of an application, of a new change and of a new release, and we weigh those requirements against each other to figure out what the most critical business functionality is in the application, and we'll make sure that we test that first to make sure that that whenever we release to production, that there is not an outage. So we did a whole study on that, on how risk reduction works and how there's diminishing returns while you're introducing more and more tests. And the study is written in a white paper. I'll share you the link at the end of this webinar. But basically what it comes down to is like the higher your risk coverage, the less defects are expected in the code, and therefore the higher the quality of your code. So that's the second aspect that we're looking at from an ROI calculation, trying to find defects as early as possible, as quickly as possible, so that we don't have to solve it in production. Because if we have to solve it in production, first, it's very costly to fix. Secondly, it can cost us business because of the downtime of the systems in production, right? Especially if it's a critical error. Then the third component is how much time and costs can we save by doing testing more efficient, right? So if we're shifting manual testing to automated testing or test automation, we can do more in the same time, or we can do the same in less time, right? So we're saving time and costs there. So what are the input parameters that we require to do such an ROI calculation? It's first of all, we need to understand what the cost of labor is from a testing perspective per annual for the organization, right? How many test cases do we have? How many releases do we have currently, and how many releases will we have in the future, right? What are our daily rates of our people in the organization? How much do we spend on reporting? How many applications do we actually have to cover, right? So all of these components are variables in an ROI calculation that will get you to an understanding what the investment is required and what you can expect on a 3 to 5 year term whenever you're implementing that transformation.
Got it. Interesting. And I mean, it all makes sense, right? A lot of people talk about speed is the new currency. And especially, I mean, you mentioned it before, testing smarter, not harder, I think is one of the drivers. So this sounds all great in theory, right? And I think, we come back to what I said before. Is the question is, can we have an example, or can we look at this, how it really gets deployed and how this looks like for a customer?
Yep, of course. So How we do this at Tricentis, we have a dedicated team that does ROI calculations, extensive ROI calculations with our customers. So I actually pulled up an example here of a large food and beverage manufacturer in France, which we have done earlier in the year with them. And whenever we do an ROI calculation, we basically look at these three layers that I was talking about, right? But to be able to come up with an ROI, to be able to come up with a business case, we first need to look at certain input parameters in the organization. So what you see here, so it's a very large study, and I'm not going into every single detail of this input data, but I highlighted some of the key components that are relevant and that have the biggest influence on that ROI, right? So the very first component is the risk coverage, which I was talking about before. So what is the current risk coverage, the test suite that we currently have in place in the organization? What is the expected risk coverage in percentage? A lot of organizations actually, before they undergo a transformation, don't even calculate the risk coverage. So we typically see that organizations are between 45 to 55% range in risk coverage if they haven't optimized their test portfolio yet. They are not using any methodical approach to test design. We typically see that ballpark range. And while they're transitioning to Tricentis products with our test case design methodology, we can help them to increase that to the 80 to 90% range, right? So that's the first aspect of it. The second aspect of it is that we do an ROI calculation or a business case on an enterprise transformation. So we don't really only look, we can look at one application, but we can also look at a whole landscape of applications. In this specific case, we looked at SAP, so this specific ROI calculation was targeted towards SAP. But maybe in your organization, you're trying to transform your digital space, and you might have many web applications, right? So instead of one application, you might be covering 10, 20, or 50, or maybe even 100. And at the same time, we also need to know what the release frequency is on average of all those applications. So how often do we release? And do we have new patches? Do we have minor releases? Do we have major releases? Because the more we have to do that, the more we have to run our tests, right? So the more relevant it becomes to use methods like automated testing. We need to understand how much it costs us whenever a defect is introduced in production. So how much does it cost us to fix, and how much business does it cost us? So this is a ballpark number. The higher that number is, the more critical it is to make sure that you're doing your testing properly. And then the last component is, of course, how much money are we currently spending on testing, which in this specific case was 1.4 million. Those were the input parameters. Now, this specific customer, their ask was they are undergoing a digital transformation, and testing is their bottleneck. They have manual testing in place. They don't have any automated test cases in their process right now. They're becoming more agile. They're becoming more DevOps. They have already transformed into Scrum teams, but testing is still running behind. And they are noticing that now. And while they want to increase their release frequency in the organization, they can't really keep up with testing anymore. And that's why they were talking to us. So in this specific ROI calculation, what we will see is if we would have only looked at it from a pure cost savings perspective, we will see that in the current state, we're currently spending 1.4 million, but in the future state, which I will show you in a second, we'll see that cost will actually remain the same or even go slightly up. But what we get in return for that is the amount of, we are going to increase the risk reduction in the testing stages, right? So we're testing basically more, we're covering more, so we're preventing the number of defects in production. And therefore, we're avoiding a lot of costs. Secondly, because we're introducing capabilities like test automation in this specific organization, we enable the organization to execute test cases more often, and therefore allowing them to do more test runs, and therefore enabling that organization to release more frequently. So as you see here, their current cost of testing was for 1.4 million. Their defects in tests that they found at the current state is 650 defects at the moment in their manual testing, but they had quite a few defects in production, and they are not releasing that often. And in the future state, they're going to spend 1.6 million in testing on a yearly basis. So there's actually an increase, as you can see, right? But at the same time, from a cost avoidance perspective, we're almost like, well, at least preventing 10 times more costs in production by not introducing those defects, right? We're going to be able to deliver 9 times faster because we're transforming the testing organization, and we can implement test automation. And we're finding, because of that, because we're testing more often and more frequently, we are expected to find a lot more defects which we are preventing in tests, except instead of having them in production.
Got it. Very interesting. And sorry, I was smiling. We just can see when we listen to you, how much engaged you are with this topic. So we can see that you are, really into this topic. So I was wondering one more thing before we move on, right? This sounds all great, as I said before. Is there also a way for us or for the customer to measure what we promised on the front end?
Yep. Absolutely. So this is really cool stuff, right? What I was just showing. And if you're really interested, and if you're undergoing an enterprise transformation, so we're talking about like a big investment for your organization to transform your testing organization, please get in touch with me. Please get in touch with our organization, and we can really help you build this extensive business case that I was showing you, right? And we have done that with organizations for years and all over the world. But in some cases, or in a lot of cases, this is too extensive, what I was showing now. In a lot of cases, you just want a quick business justification for your project or for your product to show to your management or to your boss or to your organization what you're investing and what you're expected to get out of it, and you want to do that quick, right? Just as a justification. So what we have done at Tricentis is basically we have distilled all of those ROI calculations and all of those business cases that we have created over the years, and we distilled like core pieces of that information, like for example, what was the current situation and how much are we spending on testing, and when we're starting to use Tricentis, how much are we spending after 3 years, for example, right? From how many applications are we covering, the number of test cases, what was our current situation with the number of test cases, and has that decreased or increased? Same for the business risk coverage and for the automation rate, right? We captured all of that information, and we basically put some calculations and algorithms on top of it, and that's where we got to an online ROI calculator, where we made it really simple for you, where you can just input a couple of input parameters into the application, and it will give you a ballpark number of what you can expect as an outcome, right? So that you can use for a quick for a presentation or a quick verification on to find out for yourself, is it worth to transform my organization? Is it worth to implement things like test automation in my organization, or is it not worth it, right? So let's have a look at that. Okay, so I pulled up the ROI calculator, which you can reach from our Tricentis website, tricentis.com, and on the Tricentis website, there's a link to the ROI calculator, or you can go directly to the tricentis.com/test automation ROI, as you can see in my URL here. And what we're doing in this ROI calculator is we're asking you a couple of questions. So we're interested in the industry you're in. We're interested in either your testing spend, so how much are you spending on a yearly basis on testing, or if you don't know that, we actually have done a study based on the annual revenue of an organization. We can estimate your testing spend as well, so based on the industry benchmark that we got from Deloitte, Gartner, Capgemini, and Society. So either one of those is fine. Then you select the top 5, the maximum top 5 most important applications in your organization that you are covering. So that could be SAP, it could be Salesforce, web applications, mobile, whatever is relevant for your organization. How many applications your organization is actually testing. Then we also would like to know how much, on an average, how much you're actually how much of those applications is actually already automated, right? So in percentage, what's your automation rate on average for your end-to-end functional testing? How much time are you spending on testing for each release on average? And then the last question is, how much releases or updates do you have per year? Right. So let's take an example, and let's take an example for a bank. And our bank is, and let's take specifically the example of the Salesforce, the SAP and Salesforce in the bank, and they're spending 3.5 million on testing every year for the SAP Cloud, as well as their Salesforce applications. So we're covering 2 applications for this specific bank. And we have done some automation. So we used the Micro Focus suite before, but basically the teams don't really know what is in there because it's a script-based testing approach. So the automation, it's actually not being used right now, so the automation rate is very low. We're spending around 5,500 hours per release at the moment, and we're going to increase the number of releases to 10 releases per year, okay, on average. So if we fill all that information out, we basically calculate. We click on the calculate, and we get the 3 buckets that I was talking about earlier before, right? In my presentation, we look at it from a speed perspective. That was the time to market component I was talking about. We're looking at it from a quality perspective, so that's the risk reduction I was talking about. And we look at it from a cost perspective, which is the cost savings and the cost avoidance. Right. So from a speed perspective, we can expect in this specific case for these applications to have an accelerator from manual testing for at least 6 times. And the reason for that, and the reason why we're saying 6 times, is because there are a lot of accelerator packs for products like Salesforce and SAP. So we have Live Compare, for example, for the impact analysis. So that will optimize your test portfolio, right? We have for Salesforce, we have an accelerator pack. So a lot of the components that you will have in your Salesforce applications are already covered by our Tricentis suite. So it's just a matter of dragging and dropping to create your test cases. So it will really help you to basically speed up the development process of your test cases, and that will also help you in the maintenance. And if you're doing manual testing before, you will see a big win there over time, right? And that will only increase after 3 years, after 5 years. If you keep using that, you will see a big benefit there. It's the same from a cost perspective, right? Because we're talking about these applications, we can save a lot of costs because we're basically after the transformation, we're going to do less work because we're, like Christian said earlier, we're going to work smarter because the impact analysis will tell us what areas are affected in the application. So we don't have to run the full regression suite anymore, but we just run the test cases that are relevant for the impacted areas, right? And therefore, we will see quite a significant efficiency gain in testing. And at the same time, because we are using a method which is called business risk coverage, instead of talking about number of test cases, we're looking at business risk coverage, and we're using methods like test case design to generate and come up with our test cases. You can see an actual risk reduction of more than 90%. So these numbers are obviously not set in stone, right? That should give you a ballpark number of what you could expect whenever you are using our Tricentis products. But at the same time, if you wanna do a real transformation and a real business case calculation, get in touch with us, and we can really do such a calculation that I showed you earlier in the slides.
Awesome, Jori. Thank you for walking us through this. Unfortunately, we are, oh my God, almost on the end of our session. I hope it was interesting for all our viewers out there. I would argue, and I think Jori is on my page, nothing happens anymore in this industry without a business case. I think we all have to get our act together and figure out what needs to be covered and what we have to look at. Let's see, we have a minute or two left. So let's jump quickly into a couple of questions. Let me check that. Question number 1, Jori, from Emily. What was the actual return of investment and the break-even point of the extensive calculation? So she is going back to the example that you showed us before. You showed us the website. Yeah. What was the return of investment break-even point for them?
Yeah, that's actually that's a great question. So I actually didn't display all the slides of that story because the full ROI calculation was actually 6 or 7 slides long. But good that you asked that, Emily. So like I said in my presentation before already, right? So really, if you just look at it from a cost savings perspective, the return on investment just on the cost savings perspective is negative. And the reason behind that is because we're not going to do the same work before and after, but we want to basically do 4 times as much, and that was their ask, right? We want to release 4 times as much in a year. So from once per year release, as you can see in this specific slide here, we're going now to 4 releases per year, and we're doing that with almost the same cost, right? So that's where the break-even point, or that's where the benefit is coming from. So we're increasing their risk coverage, we're increasing their cost avoidance over 3 years, and we are enabling the organization for basically an investment of a couple $100,000 to release 4 times as often as they are able to do now. I hope that answers your question, Emily.
Perfect. Excellent. One more is, let's take this one from Vishnu. Hopefully I spelled the name right. What is the best way to present this information to our leadership team? Which I think is a very valid question, right? One thing is, getting these things together. Number two is, how to kind of, make it crisp and clear to the management.
Yeah, it's super important that you basically, whenever you're talking to your leadership team, you want to make sure that you're talking their language, right? So what your leadership team is looking at is they want to tie outcomes to business outcomes, right? So whatever investment they are making, what business outcomes can he expect from that? So if a CIO needs to make a decision whether he invests some money in bucket A or bucket B, the only thing he is interested in is, if I invest $100,000 or $1 million here, how much will I get out of it, right? And therefore, what you want to do whenever you talk to them is you want to understand, where is your business going? So what is the expected outcome that your business is looking for? And then tie all of those results that we were talking about here from a speed, cost, and quality perspective back into that ask from your CIO. And with that, when you're presenting it that way, that's how you can basically get your investment and get your transformation started.
Awesome. Hey, sorry, Jori, we really have to go. We have a lot of other questions. So as I mentioned on the beginning, guys, we will respond to all the questions on email. Thank you very much for joining us today. As I mentioned on the beginning, this webinar will be available on the Tricentis Resource Center. There are a lot of others. I really want to thank Jori for joining us today. I mean, as I mentioned before, you can see he's passionate about this stuff. He's spending, I would argue, the last 10 years of his life in digging into this. Thank you very much, Jori, for joining us today. And guys, be safe out there and take care.
Thank you.
Bye.